right, hello everybody. So we're working through test 395 here, going through our questions on the reading and writing, both modules. We will be addressing all the questions on the reading side, so all the vocab, everything like that, all the questions on the writing side, including grammar, everything like that, for both modules here in this video for, again, test 395. All right, so our first question here on 395 comes in the form of a word and context question. All right, so typically the SAT is giving most of our word and context questions like we see on question 2, but we do get a couple per test that are in the form of question 1, where we have the word in context, and then we need to see what best fits to replace that word, essentially, right? So there are two things I want us thinking about when we work on one that is in the context like this. We need it to fit the context, but we also need it to match the meaning. Okay, so it is insufficient for us to just have it mean the same thing or just to fit in the context. If you miss this question, it's likely you didn't do one of the other. All right, so the first one I'm going to show you that I think is a difficult one to get rid of is amount, okay? Because amount fits in here, all right? It works within the context, okay? At supper time, Foxfoot would allow no fire to be built, no landing to be made, no amount of their passing to be left, okay? You could make it the claim that amount kind of could fit in the context of this. But does amount mean trace in the way trace is working in the context of this sentence? No, right? So it doesn't fit both of these parameters, even if the word kind of sounds like it could work here. All right. In this instance, what we're looking for is to say no clear sign. We're looking for sign that their passing had been left. All right. So evidence and sign can mean the same thing here, okay? We're not talking about sign like a stop sign. We're talking about sign as in like some evidence or something that demonstrates that they had been there, all right? Blemish doesn't work. No blemish of their passing. That doesn't really make sense. Blemish is like an imperfection. And then trace and sketch, right? Those have the same meaning in some instances. They're synonyms in some instances, but in the context of this, they're definitely not synonyms. So this is a relatively easier question, but I think the format of it in which you have a word in there that you need to find the closest meaning to can create a little bit of a trick for students to have to overcome. All right, question 2, we have another vocab question. It's a word in context question. This is a good question from the SAT, a good tricky question from the SAT. That's pretty typical of what we see our difficult vocab questions being, in that there is a word in here which kind of makes sense broken down, but doesn't fit the kind of idiomatic or colloquial way we would use this. So we see like the logic of the passage is one of the first things we need to make sense of, okay? If you understand the logic of the passage, you get this, which is basically to say that there's an advance indication of solar flares, right? Something suggesting that a solar flare is incoming, right? Or the correct answer, impending. Impending is like impending doom. It means it's something that is imminent, meaning it is something that is about to happen, guaranteed to happen in a matter of some time frame, but we know it will happen within a time frame. All right. Now, the answer choice that I think is really compelling here is antecedent. Okay. Antecedent means before, right? Something's antecedent is something that comes before. It's like an ancestor. Okay. And we see preceding a flare. Preceding and antecedent are really close in meaning. And if we're looking for just to do, okay, what synonym can I plug in there that fits with something before? You might end up falling for antecedent if you know what that word means, or if you use the 90-10 rule to kind of figure it out based off of our roots and our prefixes. However, we need to understand the full context, right? So indication doesn't just mean before, right? It means before showing that it's going to happen. So impending fits that meaning in the text, that definition in the text, better than antecedent does, though antecedent does have a synonym somewhere in there, or relatively related word. Innocuous is wrong here. Innocuous means it's like harmless. We're not talking about harm or anything really here other than interfere with telecommunications, which is actually an opposite distractor to innocuous. If it interferes with telecommunications, it's not innocuous. And finally, that it doesn't really fit. And then perpetual would mean that it is always going. And as we can see logically, this is something that happens at a certain point. It isn't happening when we see if it can be preceded, it isn't perpetual ultimately. So perpetual is a logical here. So antecedent is pretty tricky to get rid of, but it's clear that impending is our best choice. All right, so question 3 is a classic example of how in the words and context vocab section of the SAT often provides us an answer choice where the definition we most commonly think of with the word is not the definition that's in use. So the correct answer, exploited, is usually used to mean kind of like take advantage of, right? Workers are exploited by their bosses, meaning the boss is taking advantage of the worker's labor to make him or her more money than they're really adding to that calculus, right? So it's kind of like taking advantage of, smaller or weaker countries are usually exploited by bigger, stronger countries. In the instance, perhaps there's a country which is pretty much surrounded or within another country, and that country decides like to take the resources, take the land, or take the people from that place. That's the typical way we think of exploited, right? Taking advantage of. But exploit can also be used to mean basically to make use of something, right? Or to make productive use of something. Okay. So, especially when or to make an advantage out of something, especially when the thing that's being exploited is not a human. All right. Exploited can essentially be utilized. The connotation of exploited, meaning utilized, can sometimes have that negative taken advantage of connotation, and particularly when we talk about people exploiting other people or people exploiting situations or something like that. But in this case, it's functioning as utilized without that negative connotation, without any sort of value context added. All right. So exploited works here. Why? Because they're saying they utilized the tendency of some metals' internal magnetic fields to alter under stress to show that these pipes, to measure these pipes without digging in to get them. Okay, so basically what they're saying is they're using something that we know about metals, right? That their magnetic fields alter under stress as a way to show that we can measure the stress level of these metals without having to dig down or unearth, right, these pipes. Okay, so exploited works there. The answer choice I'm most likely seeing as incorrect is hypothesized, right? Meaning to evaluate a claim. We often see hypotheses in scientific type situations, in, for example, a situation like this, right? But remember, a hypothesis is something that is not yet proven. A hypothesis it's not a guess, but it isn't yet a claim. It's something that, it is a claim, but it isn't yet a theory. It isn't yet something that we can demonstrate in any way. It's something that we're seeking to identify and demonstrate. So a hypothesis would be something that they don't know yet. But clearly in this passage, the engineer and the colleagues know that metals' internal magnetic fields alter under stress. It is that tendency of metals is not something that we don't yet know that we need to test to find out if it is true or not. It is true. They know it's true, right? They just wanted to show that you could use that tendency. Again, exploit meaning to use or to utilize. You could use that tendency to test metal stress levels without digging down. Right? So hypothesize doesn't work here because though there may be hypotheses in this passage or like in this experiment elsewhere, this tendency is not something that's unclear or only believed to be possible. Discounted is an opposite distractor, right? So that would be to say that like they don't believe that this tendency is valuable, or they believe that this tendency may, not relate to this situation. That doesn't make any sense there. And then finally, redefined would mean if they were changing the meaning of this tendency, perhaps, which isn't in here at all. So exploited is used in a way that is a little different from our typical connotation of it, and hypothesize doesn't work because though this is science, it isn't something that still needs to be proven. All right, so question 4 on this module 1 suggests 2 things to me. If you're missing this, 1, it's likely that you need to study vocab more. Ameliorate is a word that is in our vocab lists. It has a pretty definitive meaning, right? Ultimately, it's a word that we should know, though it isn't a word that we maybe use in everyday context, okay? Ameliorate is when you make something kind of better, right? When you make better in a way where you're helping something that's been harmed, right? So like to improve something from when it was not good. So we see a bad situation at the front, right? Many studies have used unrepresentative subject pools because it's all people from universities, right? So to fix this situation or to improve or make better the situation, we need to actively recruit subjects from diverse backgrounds and locations, basically not just college students, right? So ameliorate perfectly fits the context. It perfectly fits the context. If you know that word, you're going to get this every single time. If you don't know that word, you're going to get this right maybe occasionally, right? Because the second thing I wanted to say, this is a really good situation in which we can use the process of elimination to arrive at answer choice B, ameliorate, even if we don't know what it means, okay? But in my ideal world, you do know what this means. You just get the answer because you've studied your vocab. So to show some other things, right? To sanction, right? Sanction doesn't work here if we know what sanction means, because sanction is basically to say either something is allowed or to say that we don't allow something, right? So we use sanctions on other countries to restrict the flow of their economy, or we can have, say, a faculty sanction event, meaning that like it's supported by the faculty. Kind of weird that it can mean 2 opposite things, sort of, but that's what sanction means. It has nothing to do with fixing or improving, all right? To rationalize this situation, okay, if they were rationalizing it, they would need to say, well, look, college students are already a diverse, enough study group that they don't make this unrepresentative, right? If the claim that came after that to rationalize this situation said college students are a fine study group, then rationalize would work. However, that's not what happens here. They say that they're looking to do something else. Finally, postulate means something kind of like a hypothesize or something kind of like hypothesize. A postulation is akin to a hypothesis, right? It is an educated guess based off of a lot of inference, a lot of education, a lot of information to say, well, looking at these things, it seems as though X, Y, and Z, right? Based on the following parameters or evidence, it seems like we could suggest A, B, C. All right. Postulate doesn't work here because 1, it doesn't really fit idiomatically there. To postulate this situation is really something that no one would ever say. I postulate that. Okay, it's usually used in that form. But beyond that, right? This isn't a guess. This isn't uh, uh, a hypothesis, right? This is kind of a suggestion or a proposal. So, therefore, to fix the situation, to ameliorate the situation. All right. So study that vocab if you're missing a question like 4. Question 5 is a purpose and details question from the SAT. It's a fairly straightforward question. We're looking to identify kind of the main purpose or the main idea here, what the claim of the passage is. The biggest thing we want to avoid is making too big of an inference, right? We don't want our inference to come from anything other than the text. Okay. So a few things that I would be concerned about as too far of an inference would be an answer choice like A, right? Where are we talking about modern papers here? Nowhere, right? Even though this is in the present tense, it doesn't suggest this. Now, everything up until here is good in D, right? But were they so popular in Mexico or were they popular in Texas? They were popular in Texas, all right? So some classic distractors here, right? This is what we would call a baggage distractor. Okay, this is what we would call a half-right distractor. Okay, the answer choice B is our best option because it just encapsulates what happens here in a way that doesn't make any errors, which is the way we want to look at this. So they thrived in Texas and especially in El Paso, right? In the late 1800s, there were many, many papers, and the majority of them were in El Paso had a lot of them. I don't want to say the majority, it had a lot of them. So that's what we have here. Watch out for distractors. Always go from what's wrong to find what's right. Question 6 of Module 1 is a reading question which asks about function. All right, so we're thinking about the role a sentence plays in the text as a whole. I always bring up an analogy. When we think about the role of an engine in a car, though an engine, when it's turned on, does produce heat, its role is to move a car forward, right? To provide energy that makes a car move forward. So we want to think of the whole context. Always think of the whole context. Here, what we have underlined describes how Mary Beth Wilhelm and astrobiologists study the Atacama because it looks or acts kind of like the extreme environment of Mars, right? There's no water in the Atacama, yet things live there. There's no water on Mars. Maybe that's how we know that how we could find things that live there as well. All right. So why are they conducting research? Why are astrobiologists, right? Like biologists of the stars, researching the Atacama because it maybe mirrors Mars. While we do compare conditions in the Atacama and the desert with those on Mars, that happens mostly here. And also, it isn't really a contrast. It's more of a positive comparison. This might be described right here, but in the underlined portion, happens elsewhere, right? C, even though we don't discuss why exactly they are researching in the Atacama, in this sentence, knowing the rest of the passage clarifies C. And then finally with D, right, not there whatsoever, right? They don't talk about the limitations of study in the Atacama Desert. They don't talk about the difficulty of studying due to remoteness or anything like that. They're just saying it's harsh, which is good, which is what we want. Question 7 on Module 1 here is very typical of an SAT reading question in that we have a bunch of kind of useless information. For lack of better language, the SAT is always yapping. Always yapping, right? We got stuff that doesn't really mean much for the context of the question here. We have a lot of kind of superfluous information here. And we also see things like there is an irreducibly contextual dimension of transportation mode choice. All right. You have to translate that. They put that in there because the SAT is mean. They want you to miss questions, questions which are otherwise altogether easy because they don't want you to see long passages because they want you to think that the test is easier than it actually is. So what does an irreducibly contextual dimension of transportation mode choice mean? Means that your mode choice, meaning whether you take a car or a bus or a train or a bike, is always based on the context, right? So it's not just that it's cheap, might also be that it actually brings you somewhere you want to go, or it, actually runs on time. There's more to it than just the fare. Okay, so what are these factors according to them? Density, spatial distribution of jobs, and the demographic characteristics of individuals, all right? They're putting things in what we call jargon. Okay, this is a classic move of the SAT to make us uncomfortable when we read a passage. We use a lot of technical language or jargon to make us feel like we're reading something that we'll never be able to understand. We just got to translate it and see. They're saying, using transit has a lot of different factors. Therefore, right, while what you do in the system does impact rides, right, how much people ride it, part of the other issue is things outside of their control. Okay. So an objection would be to say that actually just making it cheap or, make reproducing the features of their system will make it used elsewhere, right? C suggests that there's something unique about Mexico City that is not present elsewhere, right? But that's not claimed either, right? We're not comparing it to anywhere else. We're just saying that you can't compare it to anywhere else, really, right? And then finally, D, to substantiate something, would need to provide some sort of evidence, okay? If you chose D, you're probably on the right path of saying, okay, this has some sort of relationship to this information here. But this is a recycled language distractor, and that this recycled language is there, but it doesn't answer the question, right? It says, what is its function? Well, it doesn't substantiate. We're not getting information here that proves a claim, which is what it means to substantiate. So our only answer choice is B, which is basically that it says, right, influencing ridership by altering characteristics or by working in the system features is difficult, right? Because there's other things at play. We always are looking at the context, which is in an irreducible dimension, okay? So whatever, this is kind of a silly question. It's a little bit difficult to navigate. But once we really think of it logically and we move through our answer choices and see what they really say, it's pretty easy. It's a good example of questions in which even vocab is relevant even when we don't have a word and context question. It'd be hard to get rid of D if you didn't know what substantiate means. Okay, 8, we have a typical science passage here, a typical science text. We have a couple of units of information that we almost always see in science texts. Units of information or kind of a similar structure, right? We have something that's really related to the scientific method, okay? Typically, we start with a question. If you took our summer course, you'll see that this is something we talked about, right? We typically start with a question, which is kind of related to a hypothesis, right? Leading into a hypothesis. From that point, we then move into our methodology, right? The way by which we attacked something, a study or something like that. Then we find some results / conclusions, right? What kind of things do we see as a consequence? And then finally, we maybe go to next steps slash scientific review, right? This very much aligns with what we typically see in the scientific method, right? We observe something, we postulate something about it, we ask a question, and we postulate a hypothesis. We examine that hypothesis with an experiment or a study, and we see what were the results of this study, and we compare it to our hypothesis, and then come to a conclusion based off of that, right? If it's in the positive, we then send it to scientific review, take next steps to maybe make it more scientifically sound, logically rigorous. And if it failed, then we go back to the drawing board, right? So here, we want to remember that not every scientific thing we do is correct, right? The scientific method has plenty of instances in which your hypothesis fails. That's the kind of the point of science. This is one where it fails, right? So what's our question, right? Human activities, which includes changing vegetation cover, influences carbon and nitrogen levels in soil. Though how deep, and here deep is not being used in a literary way. It is being used literally, meaning how deep into the ground these effects extend is unclear. So how deep into the ground the effect of human activity impacts nitrogen and carbon levels is our question. So here's our hypothesis, right? They're kind of guess. Land use differences land use differences produce differences in these carbon and nitrogen levels below, deeper than just the topsoil, right? Which is the top 30 centimeters of soil. So now we have their method. Their method is they sampled soils across multiple land use types within several different locations. However, they found that across all of these different land use types, low levels of nitrogen and carbon were found deeper than 30 centimeters. So it seems like their hypothesis that even beyond the topsoil, humans cause differences in carbon and nitrogen. Their hypothesis was seemingly proven false, at least in this context, right? So a phenomenon that exists is something that we can see or hear, right? It's something that we already know to exist. That's not the case in A, right? The depth of these effects is something that we don't yet know. Okay, we don't refine their hypothesis either, right? We don't get a new hypothesis at the end. B gives us perfectly how we would describe it, right? So we get our question, then we get our hypothesis, right? So we get our Q, we get our H, we get our M, and then we get our R in conclusions, right? So we get our question, we get our hypothesis, and then we see, okay, in conclusion, this kind of undermines our hypothesis. C, it starts out right, but we don't get competing hypotheses, right? We don't get more than one hypothesis here. And then D, do we validate the hypothesis at the end? No, right? So remember, if in an answer choice, if one thing is wrong, we have to throw the whole thing out. The whole answer choice must be correct to use an answer choice. Always go deductively, meaning find things that are wrong and get rid of those. With question 9, I want to show us something just to start off with here, where we see this according to the text. That means we have a detail question, right? A detail question means that our answer is going to be nearly verbatim in the text. All right, so what do some historians suggest about Maya civilization? All right, so what is suggested? Well, that a few things about the Maya, right, is that they at the very least, well, suggest it's a bit of an inference, right? So what do they suggest? Some historians suggest, there's the words, okay, that the Maya mathematicians inherited from the Olmec even earlier. All right. the even earlier Olmec civilization, okay? So A does that perfectly, right? A encapsulates this right here. Again, this is a detail question according to the text. That means our answer choice is going to probably be verbatim in the text in every way. All right. B is not at all relevant. I don't know how that's an answer choice, to be honest. C might be a little bit of a baggage distractor, right? You might have watched a little bit too much of the History Channel if you're choosing C. And then D also, I mean, I really don't see the logical inference there. So for 9, A is the only one that does what a detail question should do, which is use the text to create our answer. Oops. All right, so question 10, we have a little bit, it's a weird one, all right? This is maybe a command of evidence, maybe it's some sort of literary thing, okay, where we are looking to illustrate the claim. So most important part of this is the claim, very upset. Here we have an example of how vocabulary is relevant on the test beyond just the word and context questions. Why do I say that? Well, here, very upset is not referring to what we might think of as upset, right? It's using an older form of upset. When we think of upset, a lot of times we think of just anger, anger, anger. I'm really upset right now, especially maybe someone like a banker, you would think. But upset can mean a wider range of emotions, including sadness or having, some breakdown, right? So D shows that, right? The banker is, crying. He's not able to sleep. He's very emotional, right? A, cautiously, we don't see any emotion, anything like that in this answer choice. B is a nice thing, but it has nothing to do with being upset. And then C, if we don't know what spoilt and frivolous means, you might think, this is where he's upset. I see. What is spoilt and frivolous? Right? Spoilt means he's spoiled. That's the older form that we would conjugate that. And then frivolous means kind of like interested in meaningless things. So the only answer choice which shows the emotional element of upset is D. And in 11, we are asking to complete an inference, right? To complete a statement. So we need to make sure that we are using both our graph or our figure rather, and our passage to put them into links, okay? So we're talking about de-extinction, all right? So turning something, what is de-extinction? We use breeding or cloning and genetic engineering to bring back species which are extinct, right? So there's a bunch of obstacles, but what is the most important one we see? Specifically, the longer a species has been extinct, the less likely it has a suitable habitat for it, okay? So de-extinction is tough for the older species, the longer they've been extinct, because we don't know where they'll be able to live, right? There's no suitable habitat for them. So in this case, among candidate species, this would be especially concerning for, well, we would want to look for just the oldest species here, right? So it's the saber-toothed cat because it was extinct the longest away. So I think the best answer choice that we might be choosing, which is wrong, is C. All right, the woolly mammoth, which became extinct several thousand years before the saber-toothed cat. If true, C would be the perfect way to use data from the table to complete the statement. This is a very typical distractor on the SAT with these now, where they give us an answer choice that, if it were true, would be perfect, but it isn't true, right? In a sense, it's like the best answer, but it is not correct, right? This is a very, very common distractor type on these new command of evidence SAT questions. Be on the lookout for them. If you chose C, you chose something that's logical, but it's just, is 6,000 years ago further back than 11,000 years ago? No. So C can't be true, right? Make sure you're looking at the data. All right, so question 12 is pretty straightforward, simple, right? We want to illustrate a claim. All right, so what is the claim? That there are mixed feelings about her surroundings, right? So we need to describe surroundings, and we need to do it in a way that demonstrates mixed feelings. So D, we definitely get the surroundings, right? But is there mixed feelings here? No, it's just repellent, just revolting, right? So if you're misunderstanding what mixed feelings means, if you understand mixed feelings to mean negative feelings, right, you're going to miss this, right? But we need both positive and negative things. Same with A, right? A and D both make the distractor of saying that mixed feelings means just negative. But then we look at C, right? We see they're happy about something, except they think one part of it is bad, right? They don't like the wallpaper. So we get both good and negative feelings, mixed feelings based off of something that's surrounding her, the room. Okay, so 13 is a great question. This is an example where the graph and the text are very related, but we really need to understand the text in order to know what's going on here. All right, because our graph only has one value, right, which is manganese to calcium ratio. And we need to know what that means to translate what that means. Okay, so manganese to calcium ratio is negatively correlated or inversely correlated with oxygenation levels. So oxygen levels would be really low here, right? So when manganese is high, oxygen is low, and oxygen levels would be really high here. Okay. So when they change in the up, it means that oxygen is going down and vice versa. Right, so from 10,000 to 8,000, manganese levels went really high in the alboron C, meaning that oxygen levels changed significantly in the negative, right? But then we see in the Meridian coast, manganese stays really the same the whole time, right? So what do we need to know? 9,000. This range here is in the alboron C, the coral decreased a lot. And right here is when in the Meridian C, coral decreased a lot. All right. So here it was really, it had a, here there's a big change in oxygen and here there isn't. So the researchers concluded that oxygenation may have been important in the Alboran Sea, but not near the Meridian coast. All right. So why do they know that? Well, because it had no impact. It can't have had any impact because there was no change in the Meridian coast. It may have an impact in the Alboran Sea. We don't know for sure if it did or not, because correlation does not mean causation, but there is correlation here. But here there isn't even correlation, right? So we need an answer choice that says there's correlation in the Alboran Sea, but not in the Meridian coast. So answer choice A. If you chose answer choice A, you did not understand that an inverse correlation means that when manganese goes up, oxygenation goes down. So manganese went up here. That would not result in an increase in oxygenation. If this didn't say oxygenation, but rather said manganese concentration, well, then A would be correct, right? C is unclear, right? We don't know what real oxygenation levels are, for one. And secondly, oxygenation was not, well, yeah, we just really don't know whatsoever what oxygenation levels were. We only know how they changed, right? So the first half of here is true, right? But we don't know if the oxygenation level in the Meridian coast was ever low. We have no idea if it was low. That's an absolute value, not a comparative value. And the same goes for D. All right. So the only answer choice that says we see correlation in the Alboran Sea, but no correlation in the Meridian Coast, both of those being that, first sentence, second sentence, both saying that, is answer choice B. So question 14 here is a pretty classic example of a logical inference science type passage where we are talking about a kind of thing that's debated within the scientific community and then a finding that may have some sort of relationship to that debate. However, what do we need to know? So what is the debate? Well, they believe that perhaps a comet caused the Younger Dryas, which was a period of extreme cooling, and they found a crater in Greenland, right? But what's the issue is that we don't know when the crater was from. It could have been 400 million years ago, or it could have been 11,700 years ago, right? So what do we need to know for sure in order to confirm whether the Younger Dryas was related to the crater found in Greenland? Well, we would need to know the age of the crater, all right? Why then would we use it there for? So this sentence is the one I just said. So based off of that sentence, we would need to logically infer that the next claim is going to be we cannot know enough to make a conclusion because we don't know if it started at 12,900 years ago, not 11,700. All right. So B, irrelevant, right? Comet fragment. Okay. C, that's not true, right? They haven't ignored that possibility. It's been debated. And then D would be illogical as well, because that would not connect to anything in the text. The only answer choice which is connected to the text, which is connected to the logic of the text, is A, because it says that ultimately we don't even know if there is correlation, right? Because we don't know the dates. So we cannot say whether there's correlation, which means we cannot even begin to guess if there is causation. Therefore, A. Question 15 is a really good example of a passage that is very, very easy to make a baggage distractor on. All right, so the appendix is a thing that many people think has no function, right? It's a useless thing. But this passage, if we follow the logic of this passage, we should be led to believe that, in fact, there is a benefit to the appendix. What is that? Well, they emerge across multiple lineages of mammals and in not just specific. They determine that those with appendixes have higher concentrations of lymphoid tissue, which supports immune responses that the organ is attached to. So higher immune responses are a consequence of having the appendix, is what their study determined. All right. As such, we are refuting or going against the common claim that it has no function. Which answer choice refutes that? Sorry, not that one, that's for sure. B, right? It has been preserved in certain mammal species because it benefits their immune systems. So it has a function, benefiting immune systems, and that's why it exists. All right. Now, C, the necessary function, we cannot say because it's not in all mammals, right? It's beneficial, but not necessary. There's an important distinction there. You chose C. This is what we would call a too extreme distractor. All right. D kind of doesn't make any sense there. And then A is probably the closest thing to a baggage distractor, meaning it's not important. So B is our only answer choice, which goes with the logic of the passage to make the logical inference that says, though it has been thought to have no function, it in fact does help with immune response. All right, question 16 here is actually one of the more interesting questions I've seen on this digital SAT. It's actually kind of an interesting passage. All right, so we are in philosophy here. Okay, so what's an ethicist? An ethicist is someone who is contemplating what is the moral imperative of people, right? What are we supposed to do? What do we ought to do? So some ethicists hold that the moral goodness of an individual's action depends solely on whether the actions themselves are good, irrespective of the context in which they are carried out. All right, so this is saying that some ethicists believe that we can determine the morality, the goodness of an action only based on the action itself. We don't have to consider anything else, right? Things are either good or they're bad, simply put. But philosopher L. Sebastian Purcell has shown that surviving works of Aztec or Nahua, I don't know why they say Nahua there, but then they just leave it as Aztec. And also the Aztec called themselves Mexica. Either way, Aztec philosophy expresses a very different view. Purcell reveals that these works posit an ethical system in which an individual's actions are judged in light of how well they accord or agree with. Okay, here's a vocab word that we need to know in order to make sense of this passage. It's not word in context, but we need vocab. Accord with the individual's role in society and how well they contribute to the community. To the extent that these works are representative of Aztec thought, Purcell's analysis suggests that, so Aztecs, we have to think about what's the relationship between Aztecs and what this notion that goodness is whether you are good or not, right? They would probably say the moral value of an action must be about whether it aligns or agrees with the role of the individual has in society. So A says that. They would have disputed the idea. They would have disagreed with the idea that an individual's actions can be assessed by appealing to standards of behavior that are independent of the individual's social circumstances. So Aztecs would not have agreed because they are saying what this passage suggests, Purcell suggests, is that the logical, ethical framework of the Aztec is to judge somebody's moral action or the morality of someone's action based upon their relationship in society. Okay. To not do that is illogical or unsensible to an Aztec, right? To base it solely upon whether an action is quote unquote good or bad would be to refute or to go against their ethical standards. So A is correct. All right. B, now, B is kind of a wandering distractor, I would say, right? It gets really pretty close, but then kind of wanders away. So the morality of an individual's actions cannot be fairly evaluated without the proper social context, right? But that doesn't say that there, right? We can know a social context without being in the same society. So now C, up to here, this could be correct. But then this part is really unrelated, right? So actions that contributed to community can be judged as morally good, even if they're inconsistent with, perhaps we might want to say, something that other ethical systems would value as simply good or bad, right? But what it then says is with behaviors that were judged as good in all contexts, we are learning that the Aztecs don't believe there is something that is good in all contexts. Unlike what some ethicists say at the beginning of the passage, we are saying that there is no situation in which all actions are good. We only have context in the Aztec ethical framework. And then finally, D, Similar actions performed by people in different roles would have been regarded as morally equivalent unless those actions led to different outcomes for the community. That's incorrect. That's a very incorrect one. If you chose that one, I can understand why you're leading down there, though. But let me explain this a little bit more, right? What D is saying is that what the passage says more clearly is that it is how much your actions agree with what your role should be in society. Ethical value or moral goodness is determined by how well you perform your specific societal role. All right. So it isn't necessarily an ethical system that values consequences more than intentions or anything like that. Rather, it's just about how well you perform your role or how well you perform a role that agrees with the role that you should perform. So D is incorrect as well. A is the only one that says there is no particular standard of behavior other than the one that we would produce based off of a social circumstance and agreeing to what your role in that social circumstance should be. So question 17 here on module 1 is a pretty straightforward question for the SAT standards. We want to make sure that we're conjugating based off of what we see as our true antecedent. All right, so our antecedent is this person or this becoming of the Secretary General. So we want to make sure that we're referring back to the singular event, right? So this is the event becoming it. So we have something that's singular, this, all right? Both, so these is plural, would have to go to something plural. Those would have to go to something plural as well. And finally, some just also doesn't really make any sense, would be referring to something plural. So our only singular option here is C, this, which is correct because, again, we're referring to the event or the time, basically, that this person became the Secretary General of the ASEAN. Question 18 here in Module 1 is a very, very typical question of the SAT. It's something we've seen a lot when the SAT transitioned to this digital form. All right. We see questions that pack multiple instances of plural and possessive into answer choices. So let's remember what apostrophes really do to a word. Okay, we only really have 2 uses for apostrophes. Our first use would be the example of a word like can't or won't or don't, right? That's a contraction. So that apostrophe puts 2 words together to make it one shorter word. We're not considering that at all here, all right? What we are seeing in this case is the idea of possession, all right? So if you were to be able to say something like, I think they're on clocks, I believe they're called hands, right? So the hand of the clock, right? To use the same sort of word here, right? So the hand of the clock versus the clock's hand, right? If you can put it into that of the form, that means we have something which can be possessive. Not everything which has an S is possessive, right? Sometimes things have S's because they're plural. That is the far more common way that we see S's in a sentence. So the first one, I mean, this question should be pretty easy, actually, because A, C, and D all have hands in some sort of possessive form. All right. All of these show hands as possessive. We don't even really need to look at our second option much at all, right? Because every difference is made between A, B, C, and D based off of hands. All right. So one thing to notice is that hands is somewhere else in the sentence without any sort of apostrophe showing possession there. All right. So hands is just plural. When you move your hands, hands that you possess, the hands aren't possessing anything else. Between the two antennas, the pitch will shift, right? So we also know that antennas needs to be just plural because the antennas are not owning the pitch, right? You're not placing your hand through the antenna's pitch. You're just placing your hand between them and it changes the pitch. All right, so our answer is B because we actually have no possession for either noun hands or antennas here. All right, only using apostrophes if there's possession. If it's just plural without any possession, we don't need an apostrophe. Question 19 is also very representative of the SAT. This is to me a really great example of what we often see the SAT doing to trip up students. Remember, the SAT is mean, right? They want to find ways to trip up students and get incorrect answers. So we are deciding, right, how do we conjugate this verb, right, to represent in line with the correct tense, so the kind of the right time of the passage, as well as the right number of the passage. All right. So the weird thing here is that we have a bunch of things in between our subject and our verb. Right? All of this stuff in here is actually irrelevant to how we conjugate to represent. All right. So if you're missing this question, I feel like you're probably choosing something like maybe A. All right. Because you're seeing, you know, who is seated impassively at a dinner table, which, you know, it's one person, right? Billy Joel. Maybe that sounds like we want to make this a singular conjugation because there's a singular subject or singular noun before this verb. But the only subject that is associated with this verb is up there, references, right? It's plural, right? Such references. Okay, this is something that the SAT does all the time. They put a bunch of information between our subject and our verb, between the noun that is being conjugate that we need to conjugate the verb to, in order to confuse us as to, or in order to confuse as to what word we actually need to be in relationship, right? They try to make it unclear by putting all this information in between. But once we see that we're conjugating it to references, we see, okay, references, that's plural. The only one that's plural here is represent, right? B would need to be have represented. C would need to be were representing. Even though they have other problems, that's why represent is best. Question 20, we have like some previous questions on this module here, we have a very typical question of the SAT. All right, so what we see here is a noun or a subject that is really long, which we oftentimes feel like we need to separate because of its length, though in actuality we shouldn't, because if we were to separate it, we would be making unclear what our noun actually is. All right. So our noun is little known French portrait artist Marie Denise Villers. All right. As such, if we put any punctuation anywhere in that noun, we are kind of destroying the integrity of that noun. Right? We are separating it out. We're making it unclear what the noun is. So answer choices A, C, and D all could be correct if only one thing was different about this question. If right here, between of and little known, we put the word a, was actually the work of a little known French portrait artist. Now, we have a independent clause before, after, everything before the punctuation after the word artist, right? Everything before the colon or the dash would be an independent clause. Okay? But we're lacking that A. Without that A, we have a situation where everything before artist can't stand on its own. We need to go all the way to the period to find something that is able to stand on its own. Why? Because the subject noun is not clarified until we have the whole thing. Little known French portrait artist Marie Denise Villers. All right. So that kind of title, if you will, cannot be separated out. Otherwise, we make unclear what the noun, what our subject actually is. 21 is definitely the trickiest of the what we would call standard English conventions or kind of grammar questions that we see on our first module here on test 395. This is, again, a very typical question of the SAT. We're seeing kind of a classic run of this new SAT on the grammar side of 395 module 1. Here, we are talking about a non-essential phrase, a long unit of a non-essential phrase. So one thing to always remember with non-essential phrases, the whole phrase must be within the same pair of punctuation. So we can use 3 types of punctuation for a non-essential phrase. 1, we can use a pair of commas. 2, we can use a pair of parentheses. And 3, as we see here, we can use a pair of dashes. We are starting our non-essential phrase with a dash, and we must end it with a dash. But we need to make sure that we know what the full non-essential unit is, all right? So if you selected C, right, you correctly identified, okay, I need to have 2 dashes here. I can't start this thing with a dash and end it with something else, right? You probably correctly identified that. But what you did incorrectly is you didn't notice that this whole unit is a non-essential phrase. Remember, a non-essential phrase can have non-essential elements in it, all right? So, from hair to grass to sculptures is a bit of a non-essential unit within it. So, remember, with these non-essential phrases, we can take the thing out and the sentence works on its own without that there. So, Cahiers paired excerpts of these, excuse me, Cahiers paired excerpts of these conversations with photographs to powerful effect in her exhibition, The Blind, right? So she paired these conversations to powerful effect in her exhibition, all right? So that all can stand on its own. She's doing something to a powerful effect or with powerful consequences on its own, okay? What doesn't do that? Cahiers paired excerpts of these conversations with photographs from hair to grass to sculpture to powerful effect in her exhibition, The Blind. All right. If you end like C, our non-essential phrase after described with that dash, now all of a sudden from hair to grass to sculptures is essential and describes where the photographs are coming from, which doesn't make any rational sense. All right. So our only answer choice, which puts the whole non-essential unit within the pair of dashes like we need to, is B. And that's why it is correct. 22 is our first transitions question on Module 1. This is one of our more classic, easier versions of a transitions question. Sometimes I think students are nervous about selecting an answer choice like though, because it seems less official transition than a word like therefore. However, though is the only word that fulfills the role we need for this transition right here. The role that we need that transition to fulfill is one of concession and to be a pivot, all right? We need to concede that even though, or despite the fact that maybe his role was exaggerated, it was nonetheless important. Excuse me. So by demonstrating the importance, we are pivoting away from the idea that it was exaggerated to say that it was in fact important. All right. So though is our classic concession pivot word, right? Other examples include nevertheless or nonetheless. All right. It is the only word here which fulfills that role. Therefore doesn't work because therefore is a prove it type transition word. In the second place, I don't even really know of that as a transition, right? But that probably is showing time progressing. And then in other words is when we kind of restate something, usually for emphasis. All right, so none of those other answer choices fulfill the role that D fulfills, which is to show a concession and make a pivot. Question 23 is a transitions question here on Module 1 of Test 395. It's a good example of how much we need to know what the text is saying. We need to really know our context in order to understand what transition works here. All right. I think if you missed this answer choice, you likely are following the strategy of just taking answer choices, plugging them in, and seeing what sounds good. The issue with that is that all of these probably sound just fine. The thing about transitions is that they usually kind of sound good in any sentence, right? Because they sound relatively kind of educated or erudite, if you will. However, we need to make sure that the transition is stating the right relationship that exists between our two units of information, right? In this case, the first and second sentence, we want to make sure that we're communicating what the relationship between these sentences is, right? So what is this relationship? So our first sentence says that single ballot majoritarian elections for single member districts polarize into two-party systems. All right. So akin to the United States, right? We've seen this many times here, right? Single member districts, we get a two-party system with two political parties dominating the political system. All right. One winner gets the whole thing. Then we see countries with proportional representation tend to support multi-partyism, in which power is distributed among many political parties. All right. So we have two opposite situations, right? One situation with single ballot resulting in a polarized two-party system, and proportional representation resulting in a multi-party distributed power system. All right. So we need to show opposites, pivots, okay? The only answer choice that does that is conversely, right? Subsequently means that something came first and then something came second as a result, right? As a consequence of. For instance, would be we're providing an example. Okay. And in other words, it means we're kind of providing an example that clarifies meaning, right? So, for instance, is usually like an actual example of a thing, whereas in other words is kind of like usually a easier to understand summary of what we already stated. Okay. So the only one that shows this pivot, this contrasting information that we have in this set paragraph is B conversely. Okay, so you must understand these passages from a reading perspective in order to understand what kind of transition best fits. So 24 is maybe a more difficult transition question because we get one option that a lot of people are very unfamiliar with, the word hence, all right? So there are two times we'll see the beginning of this word hence, okay? We'll see it as hence itself. And we'll also see it as henceforth, okay? But henceforth and hence mean very different things, right? Henceforth means from this point on. So ever since, from henceforth or from this point on, going forward, okay, something will happen. This is a time type transition. All right. Hence is different. Hence is more related to thus. This is a cause and effect type transition. Okay. So these are two very different types of transitions, two very different use cases of transitions, even though they both sound very similar because the beginning of the word is, the same. The beginning of each word is the same. All right. So hence or thus would be very effective here because what we are saying is that because it appears to be an external body-like armor, many believe it's like an exoskeleton that you'd see on like a bug. All right. So that is that. Yeah. All right. That's why hence works. We have cause and effect, right? We have a positive relationship, if you will, between the unit of information here and the unit of information preceding it in the previous sentence. Mm. I think a lot of us, if we got this wrong, chose however. And I want to explain why however doesn't work. We have this right here. Okay. However would pivot the information. Okay. It would mean that these two units of information are not in agreement with one another. But they are in agreement with one another. What's not in agreement is this and this. Okay, these two are not in agreement. But it could be easy if we're not reading the full context to think that the sentence is saying, even though it appears external to the animal, many believe incorrectly that it's an exoskeleton, right? But because it's external to the animal, that is the reason why many believe it to be an exoskeleton. Okay, so we have a positive relationship between our first and our second unit of information, not a contrasting relationship like however would convey, right? Even though we do get a however type bit of information down here. That being said, and for instance, don't really work here. For instance, is what we would use to kind of shore up a claim, right? It's usually used to introduce an example that supports a claim. And that being said, kind of pivots away from something that's more of a concession, like nonetheless or nevertheless or although. So hence, synonymous with thus or therefore, is the right answer choice to put for 24. Question 25 is as perfect an encapsulation of the rhetorical synthesis question type as we'll ever see on the SAT. what I mean here is that the issue that often arises out of rhetorical synthesis is perfectly demonstrated. Oftentimes, students want to say, oh, what answer choice? They want to show which answer choice best encapsulates all of these notes, right? However, all we want to do is what's in here. That's why this one question type, rhetorical synthesis, is a question type where I'm fine with you reading the question first, especially if you're running low on time. There's no other question type I want us reading the question first. I think it's a bad option for most of our question types. However, here, we really see that there's only one thing we want. We don't want all of these notes, right? So the student wants to identify the real author of Adam Bede, all right, or Betty. I don't know, but George Eliot is someone who, if you've been in our summer classes, you've read George Eliot. Many people assume George Eliot was a male, a pseudonym. Who is the real person? Mary Ann Evans. All right. So we just want to say Mary Ann Evans was the actual author. Which one says that? Only A. All right. All these other answer choices talk about how someone is how George Eliot's name was a pseudonym, right? A fake name. That was indicated, all that kind of stuff. But the only one that says Mary Ann Evans was the real author, which accomplishes the goal in our question stem, is A. Okay. So we're not looking to summarize. We just want to focus on what's identifying in the question stem. And that is saying the real author was Mary Ann Evans. Only answer choice A does that. So question 26 is a rhetorical synthesis question. If you haven't seen me cover these questions before, I'm going to repeat the same strategy I always repeat here, which is that unlike any other question on the test, I'm very happy if students want to focus first on the question before they read on the passage, right? Normally, that's not what I recommend for any other question type, but here, I think it's fine. Why do I think that? Because the goal of the question is not to summarize all these notes, or usually isn't to summarize all these notes, which is a little weird, I think a little misleading from the test. What we really want to focus on is what the goal of the student is, right? So in this case, we want to specify how SALT enables energy storage. Right, we've just focused on energy storage of this from the salt. Okay. And again, this probably isn't like table salt. This is probably like a chemical salt, meaning it's, in a particular form. All right. So what do we know about this salt? So it liquefies when heated and solidifies at room temperature. All right. So why is that important? Because in a solid state, energy stops flowing and is stored in the battery. Therefore, that's how we are storing energy. Okay. So all we really want to focus on is how because it's a molten salt that goes from molten or from liquid to solid, energy stops flowing because it is solidified. All right. The only answer choice that focuses on this is C. Okay. Because we see solidifies at room temperature. It can be stored in the battery. All right. So D, while it says the result, doesn't say the how. B says that it happens, but doesn't say how. A says that it happens, but it doesn't mention energy storage. All right. So B and D don't mention how the energy storage is enabled, and A doesn't mention that energy storage happens at all. All right, so only C mentions that there is energy storage and that it happens as a result of the salt solidifying at room temperature. We only have one parameter that we're looking for really here, right? Solidifying to store energy. So the only answer choice we can go with is C. Okay, before we get into 27 here all the way on module 1 of 395, I'm just going to give a little PSA. These red-legged frogs are, struggling here in California. One of the big causes of that are invasive bullfrogs. If you or your family are people who like to eat frog legs, like some of my family was like, if you guys like frog legs, go hunt them yourself. Go get some bullfrogs. They live in a lot of places. They make the ugliest croak. They sound like a cow, kind of like, moaning off on the field. And they eat California red-legged frogs and other native frogs at an insane rate. And if you hunt those bullfrogs, they're perfectly good to eat. So look into it a little bit. If you and your family like frog legs, there's a good opportunity for you to get some in a way that helps native species from California. All right, now that the PSA is over, let's focus on this question. We have a rhetorical synthesis question here on 27. That means, and I've repeated this strategy many times, but if this is the first time watching it, you'll get it here. We might want to focus on our question before we focus on our notes. All right. So that's different from any other question type on the SAT. I always want us reading the passage first everywhere else. Here, I'm okay if you read the question first. Why? It seems natural to want to summarize the information that we're given in our notes. But typically, we are being asked only one small parameter. In this case, it is to indicate the California red-legged frogs classification. All right. 27 is a trickier type of rhetorical synthesis question because there's a little bit of an inference here. All right. We have to make what we call a safe inference. So if it is endangered, it is in danger of extinction. If it is not yet called endangered, or not yet classified as endangered, it means that it may soon become endangered. All right. So something that is soon to become endangered is threatened. And the California red-legged frog is soon to become endangered. All right. So we need to translate the definition of threatened is right here as soon to become endangered, which means that California red-legged frogs are threatened. Okay. If you miss this answer choice, you probably just see California red-legged frog right here and the word endangered right there. And you just connected those two and you chose maybe C. All right. Now, B is too broad of a classification. They're asking what type of classification are they? At risk is not a classification according to this text. All right. And then finally, A is too general as well. It just says that they are classified as either endangered or threatened. But logically, we can infer that the California red-legged frog, because it is likely to soon become endangered, is on the threatened category. As such, we can go with D. With that, we end our first module of the reading and writing section of 395. We move on to module 2. All right, so now we're moving on to module 2 here of test 395. We're beginning with question 1 of that module. We have a word and context question. So typically these word and context questions look more like we see question 2. You have a blank that you need to fill in. You're filling in a logical and precise word. But sometimes we see it like we see in question 1, where we have an underlined word or phrase, and we're looking for something that has what they say the most near meaning, right? So we have 2 parameters we always want to think of in this format of this question type, okay? We always want to make sure we're meeting 2 factors of identification. 1, we need to make sure it fits. And secondly, we need to make sure it has the proper meaning, right? Sometimes there are words or phrases which fit in the sentence, but don't actually convey the right meaning. So in this case, she, pretty clear, straightforward. She's reaching across to a black bowl piled with oranges. All right. I think this one's really pretty easy. If you're missing this question, you're likely moving too fast. When you reach across to a black bowl, you are stretching toward, right? You're reaching for it. When you're gaining on something, it means you're usually making up ground. Doesn't work here. Joining with would mean she's like connecting to the bowl in some way. And then arriving at means that there would be some distance traveled that is kind of like, it includes a time consideration here. It's more like, driving or riding a horse or something like that. So the only one here that has fit and meaning would be stretching toward. All right, question 2 on module 2 is another word in context question. This time we're looking to fill in a blank. So we're looking for a word that most logically and precisely finishes the text, right? So we are looking for something that there is only one word that works here, though there isn't really a synonym or anything that fits. Okay, so a lot of times we're looking for a synonym, but there's really nothing here. For the most part, we want to be working by way of elimination, right? Process of elimination. So to occupy detailed information would be to be in there, right? If we occupy something, we're habitating it, we're inside of it. Hoard means to like keep to yourself. A hoarder, for example, is someone who is an example you might have heard of, someone whose house is overflowing with things that they've kept and never gotten rid of. A dragon, famously in mythology, has a hoard, right? A collection of valuables that they just lay upon. If they were hoarding detailed information, now people can hoard information. We hoard information in science. Typically, it's like we won't share with, for example, maybe China or somewhere because the United States sees them as an antagonist or some other delusion. But in this instance, if they were hoarding this information, we would have to see some suggestion that they're keeping it from others, which isn't the case here. Finally, to reserve information means to like keep it for later. Withhold it, relatively similar to hoard maybe, but without maybe such a negative connotation. None of those work. To obtain information, obtain is used a little bit clunkily here, right? I probably wouldn't put that word there if I was writing this from scratch, but when you put it in here, it fits perfectly fine, right? It means that we are gathering information, gaining it from fossil deposits. So we have to go D. The question 3 is probably one that many of us are getting correct because we have the correct word, or the word that we're looking to place, comes at the very end of the paragraph, the very end of this passage. So we're likely reading the whole thing. I think one of the errors that we make for some of these easier word and context questions is we typically don't read the whole thing. But reading this whole thing, we see, okay, we have a very clear pivot word here, whereas. So that means we are looking for the opposite word of what we see in the previous clause. So intensified is the word that we're looking to give the opposite of, right? An antonym for. So the only word that is an antonym for intensified is reduced, right? So the logic of this is saying that communication between two brain regions, when it is intensive, they're decisive. When those choices, the people become less decisive, when that information flow is reduced. This is a classic example of where other words in our paragraph are maybe words that we need to know, not just the words in our answer choices, right? We need to know what decisive means here, right? And understand that decisive and more slowly are opposites of one another. When we do that, we see that reduce is the only thing that is the opposite of intensified. These other answer choices, acquired kind of sounds good without any second look at it, but once we take a second look, we see that. Acquired and determined, I mean, these are all pretty clearly incorrect distractors here for number 3. Okay, 4 is a great SAT word and context question because this is exactly the kind of question we see very often. We see vocab or words that are fairly commonplace in much of kind of everyday use, right? They're definitely words that are in everyday use, but nonetheless are words that I think many of us don't know off the bat, right? Tenuous, contentious, conspicuous, perhaps even in this form. These are all words that we maybe have a vague understanding of, but we don't know them too deeply. These are all words that are very, very certainly in vocab lists that you have access to and that you need to study, right? If you're missing a question like 4, it's because you don't know enough vocab, because this is really clear once we know what these words mean, all right? So tenuous means weak, right? Or not deep, right? So a tenuous connection would be like a connection that isn't super deeply established or super secure, okay? Enduring means long lasting. Contentious means up for debate. It can basically mean that there is kind of passionate feelings on both sides of an argument. And then conspicuous means that it is, well, it's the opposite of inconspicuous, right? Conspicuous means that it's something that we can see very clearly. Okay, something very obvious. Once we know that, the only word that really fits here whatsoever is tenuous, because when we read the logic of the passage, we see that the war is overshadowed, and because it maintained a status quo, we see that it's basically saying it is not doesn't have a strong or lasting importance in historical memory in Britain, because bigger things were happening at the same time and little changed for Britain in the War of 1812. Enduring is an opposite distractor, right? Seems like the Napoleonic Wars maybe will have an enduring place. Contentious, we would need to see some form of people debating it or disagreeing, or some sort of passionate feeling from two sides of an opinion on the War of 1812. We don't see that whatsoever. That might be something that could have been proven if you had it in the text, but it's not there. Then finally, conspicuous would mean a really obvious place in historical memory, but that isn't suggested whatsoever in the passage. So knowing these words makes this really easy. So we have to study vocab. Not knowing this, you might arrive to tenuous by getting rid of a few answer choices, then maybe having a lucky break between guessing between tenuous and contentious. But if you know all the words, there's no luck involved at all. It's just you're going to end up choosing tenuous. Okay, so question 5, we have the final word in context question on this second module of 395. Final word in context question on the test as a whole, in fact. So we have a claim being difficult to something, all right, to do something successfully. This is a classic one where we need to consider both fit and meaning, all right? Almost all of these fit in there. You read the sentence and it works. That's why we don't want to do the strategy of where we just plug and play each answer choice and see what sounds good. Because difficult to successfully imagine, difficult to successfully summarize, difficult to successfully defend, all three of those sound really good, and difficult to successfully adjust sounds maybe a little off, but it still kind of fits. All right. So we need to really understand what's the logic here. What meaning must we convey? Not just what sounds good when you put it in, what fits. All right. So we see the second sentence is really important. If you're not reading the whole thing, that's one of the reasons why you might be struggling with a question like this. We know so little about what they call the Minoans that assertions about what bull leaping meant will inevitably rely on speculation and guesswork. All right. So remember, when we're talking about claims, defending a claim means proving it. All right. Defending a claim means that you have proven it, maybe not beyond reasonable doubt, but you've proven it to where people agree with you, right? We're not talking about defending in terms of battle or defending in terms of argument, like, I have to defend myself, I'm getting defensive, right? We're talking about really a kind of social science definition of what we mean by defend. So claims are difficult to defend because they rely on speculation and guesswork. That makes perfect logical sense when we consider social science, all right? These other answer choices would need a different second sentence to prove them. I would like you, if you miss this question, just do a little thought experiment for yourself where you think, what second sentence would prove the one I chose, right? If you chose, for example, summarize, what would we want to put there? Probably something that says, you know, because they are also different from one another and come from such a varied time frame, it's difficult to use one simple conclusion or one simple depiction or discussion of these to encapsulate all the varied art forms, right? Something like that would show that it would be difficult to successfully summarize. But that's not what we have here. We have basically that speculation and guesswork are going in, therefore the claim is difficult to have proven. So remember, both fit and meaning must work in order to get an answer choice on the word and context. Our final one from 395. So here we are on question 6 of module 2. Our question is a function question. So we want to make sure we're understanding the broader context of this passage before we attempt to understand what this sentence is. All right. So when we see this here, I think if you missed this question, you maybe read this. It was he by himself and thought, he's alone in a way that, conveys some sort of loneliness or something like that, right? We might be reading in too deeply and choosing something like deep. But when we actually read this, we see that he's kind of boasting of a crazy story, really, where he's telling of this instance that he was crossing the English Channel, the weather was crazy, and it was him and the captain who were the only ones that didn't get seasick. Or maybe it was him and the second mate who didn't get seasick. But, right? So it's like a little bit of a boast. But then we see that, in any instance, at the very least, he was one of the people who didn't get seasick, right? He didn't get seasick. It's sort of, maybe true, maybe not. But that's not what we're being asked to infer. We're just being asked to see what does it do here? So be deductive, right? Get rid of things that aren't correct or there's no indication that they're correct. There's nothing that indicates that this is here, right? Nothing that indicates B, right? So when we see something about constitution here, this is an instance where vocab is showing up even though it's not a word in context question. Right? His constitution here means kind of like his fortitude or his makeup, like who he is, his kind of like internal identity. So his ability to overcome getting sick, he's boasting about it. And he does it all the time. And the story always changes just a little bit, but he is always at the center of it. Okay, here, question 7, we have another function question. All right, so this is asking about how does this underlined thing work in the context of the rest of the passage? So we have to understand what the underlined sentence says, right? And then we also have to understand what the rest of the text as a whole says. All right, so we need to get all the way through all of this. All right, so this is essentially kind of our topic sentence. So while several have found negligible, meaning small or insignificant, consequences for governments that impose fiscal austerity, that means basically limiting government spending, especially spending that benefits normal people. So despite this notion that there is negligible consequences, recently we saw electoral consequences that came as a result of supporting austerity, which is again basically like punishing working class people programs. So now we can't just look at only that to get this. We read the rest of this, right? So what is this? What would they attribute this to? They attribute this incongruity, right? This thing that shouldn't make sense, to government's tendency which is not followed in the new example, to implement austerity programs strategically to avoid electoral costs, aka they do it when people will forget about it for the next election, which has obscured the inherent risks of austerity in election data. All right. So B describes this perfectly. It says there's a conflict, right? Some people have seen that in research, austerity doesn't have an impact on elections, and yet recent events did show that there was an impact on elections. Now, then the text goes on to suggest is a result of something else, right? This describes the passage even more than that just underlined text, right? Why? Because of an analogy I'll make over and over again when we look at these kind of function questions. If I ask you what the role of an engine is in a car, right? You would be wrong to tell me, well, the role is to produce heat. Even though a car engine does produce heat, we have to look at the car to know what a car engine's role is, right? We have to see that the engine provides the energy by which the car can move forward, right? Can turn its wheels to go forward and bring you somewhere, right? So A is all correct until here. A is a tricky one. I think a lot of us are probably going to choose A because everything up until that first red mark is correct, right? But that final bit is wrong. And if anything is wrong, it has to be eliminated, right? They were using real world data. There's only real world data on elections. This one is all kind of like mumbo jumbo, if you will. Like it just isn't supported in the text whatsoever. And then finally, everything up to here is relatively acceptable in this answer choice. All right. So you have two half-right distractors that are of significance on this question, right? That we need to make sure we're not falling for. And B does everything we need. Therefore, we roll with it. Okay, so question 8 here is a cross-text connections question. We need to look at two texts together. We are always going to be asked, or almost always going to be asked, something about the relationship between these two texts, right? So how would one author respond to the other author? In what way? In particular situations? So here, we always want to remember, we don't have to invent how the author would respond. We actually get a pretty clear indication of how the author would respond based on the text. All right, we don't want to go into like some psychoanalysis of, well, this author seems to use more logos in their essay or has an argument I'd more clearly agree with. So I think they would make a logical response, right? Whatever. No, we're going to go from the text. So text 1, quickly summarized, says basically graphic novels shouldn't be classified as literature because their story relies on images. And because they rely on images, more like a film, not on language, which is what literature requires, they can't be literature, right? So by focusing or relying on images rather than language, written word, graphic novels are not literature. That shouldn't really be considered literature. That's text 1. Text 2 says graphic novels should qualify as literature, right? Because the context of the graphics, right, of the images is required to understand it. And the context is entirely produced through language, through the written word, right? Captions and dialogue produce meaning in the essay. And oftentimes there are graphic novels with prose that is just as strong as you would see in a novel without any sort of graphics or images, right? So how would the author of text 2 respond to the argument presented in text 1? The author would probably say something along the lines of, graphic novels can be literature because the language is stronger than or the importance or the role of language in graphic novels is understated by text 1, right? So it would say something along the lines of like text 1 isn't giving enough credit to how important the written word is in graphic novels. A says this pretty directly, right? It says by asserting or arguing, right? To assert something is to state something. Language plays a more important role in graphic novels than the author of text 1 would recognize or acknowledge, right? He would basically disagree with this. So A makes a lot of sense. B, if you're choosing B, that might be a baggage distractor. This might be what you think, but text 2 doesn't say that this is a real flaw. C, the storylines being difficult to understand is not a stand-in for the complexity or depth of written word, right? Difficult to understand means it's unclear. It could be more difficult to understand than the author of text 1 claims because they're just poorly written, right? And also, does text 1 ever claim that they're difficult to understand? No. All right. And then finally, D would suggest that they're too much in agreement. It's kind of an opposite distractor there. So the only one which says that, text 2 would sensibly say to text 1, hey, the literary element of graphic novels, you're understating it, is A. All right, question 9, I want us to notice an important wording in our question stem. All right, this says here, according to the text. That means we have a detail question. A detail question means our answer choice is going to be pretty much verbatim in the text. We're going to find something, identify it in the text, and make a very simple connection between the two using probably as safe an inference as we possibly can. So why are some critics skeptical of the concept? Well, here's the skepticism from critics, all right? So what is it? It's too early to tell if they can thrive, all right? So any of our answer choices say something like that. A doesn't, right? A says we can't put this elsewhere. Did critics mention that? No. B says that it's not varied enough. Did the critics mention that right here? No. And C, the construction was not less environmentally damaging. Is that mentioned there? No. All of these would be interesting criticisms, but they're not there. What are we looking for? Again, we want to say that we can't tell if they'll thrive. Right here, it's unclear whether it will support the plant life in the design. Perfect. That's why we're going to go with D. All right, question 10 here is one of the rare, interesting passages I feel like I've seen on the SAT lately. So we are distinguishing, we have to make sense of this text, all right? We need to find the main idea of the text. So reading the text is probably the most important thing you could do. You got to read the whole thing, right? I'm going to point out where I think the most important word in this passage, okay? Right here, the but, all right? We talk about this in the ACT a lot. With longer passages, a lot of times the way a passage opens is one thing, and then we see a pivot word, a but, a however, a yet, something like that, which reveals where our actual main idea, our actual kind of thesis is. Okay, so this is what many people are thinking, right? That there is some or some distinction rather between the fabula, the content of a narrative, and the sujet, I suppose. The narratives, the way it's made, right? The way it's presented and arranged. All right. So when it says distinguish here, we're not talking about like a distinguished gentleman, someone with a tie and a nice hat, right? Like we're talking about two things that are different from one another, right? Making them distinct. But theorist Bakhtin maintained that the fabula and Suzette are insufficient to completely describe a narrative. He held that systematic characterizations of artistic phenomenon discount the subtle way in which meaning is created by the interactions between the artist, the work, and the audience, right? So he basically says there is more to it, right? We cannot just consider this aspect and put them in their own little boxes and say that once you kind of add these two boxes together, you get a result, right? He's saying it's not like math. It's this whole over-encompassing thing that makes a narrative that those two things aren't enough. They don't fully encompass it, right? So answer choice A just basically says what I just said, but maybe even more succinctly, right? Narratives, there are important characteristics of narratives, right? Subtlety, interactions that are not encompassed fully by the two concepts that other theorists use to analyze narratives, right? This, by the way, like this is just an example. This isn't super important. So that's exactly what the text does. That's the main idea, all right? We want to make sure that we're not thinking the main idea is that these two things exist, right? Though that we do need to know that those two things exist in order to find the main idea, that isn't sufficient. The main idea comes here after that pivot, after that but. Always be on the lookout for that, right? For example, let's look at some answer choices which you might have chosen that don't have anything to do with the main idea, though they're in the text, right? There are a lot of true but irrelevant distractors on these main idea questions. So, could you make sense of The Godfather through the concepts from literary theory? Yeah. But one, did they say it was unusually complicated? No. Secondly, were they saying, let's look at a time when we can use these two narrative concepts or conceits to make sense of something? No. D, this is a bit of a baggage distractor, right? This is something that you could carry in here where you're like, okay, if I don't understand if I see a non-linear story, I don't understand what's going on. Okay, sure, but is that the main idea here? No. Now, finally, this is kind of our sophisticated distractor, okay? This is what I would call, let's see if I'm allowed to draw a fish. That's supposed to be a fish. This is a Finding Nemo distractor, right? Meaning is not inherent in a narrative, but created when an audience encounters a narrative so that narratives are interpreted differently by different people, all right? This is sort of like a death of the author type thing here. It's kind of interesting, right? But is that in this text? No, this text says that a narrative can't just be described by a few different forms. We have to go beyond that and embrace subtlety. So A. Okay, so question 11 here, we have what we would call a command of evidence, right? So we're asking about evidence right here. Question for qualitative. All right, so we're looking at a graph and a text and trying to put them together. So the most important thing we're going to need to read here, the most important thing we had to comprehend when we did this question is to, was to support the underlined claim. So more medicine and health research topics submitted in 2019 than any other year, right? So we need to look at the graph here and find something which supports the idea that there was more medicine and health research in 2019 than any other year. So let's go to 2019. Here we are. Medicine and health is this graph. And in fact, it was about 300, and in all years previous, it wasn't. Okay. So very simply, we're going to get the answer choice that says right around there. Very straightforward. If you're missing these sort of questions, you're probably making it more complicated than you need to. And you might be not reading or understanding the claim here. Right? What is the comparison here? 2019 to any other year. We only are looking at medicine and health compared with itself. Right? The fact that there's more medicine health in 2019 than there is cellular and molecular biology. right? Or something like that is irrelevant. Okay. Um, this has nothing to do with medicine and health. This, nor this. Okay. So if you're missing this, you're really just either reading the wrong thing, you're moving too quickly, or you're overcomplicating yourself just because you're looking at a graph. All right. This question is very straightforward, though it's one that, students miss at a relative rate. Okay. So let's make sure that we're moving deliberately, we're keeping ourselves straightforward, and we're really making sure we're looking at what the question actually asks. The question 12, we have a command of evidence textual question. All right, so we need to come up with a quote that supports the student's assertion. So what is the student's assertion? Right, so the student asserts that the escape of these glowing transgenic fish have significant negative long-term ecological effects. All right, so our answer choice needs to show that these transgenic fish are having an impact in the negative way on creeks in Brazil. So why does D show that? We see that transgenic fish, the glowing fish, introduce fluorescence into wild fish populations that makes these populations more vulnerable to predators. All right. So this is the example of there maybe being potentially significant long-term negative effects, right? If it breeds with other species or breeds with, members of the same species in the creek and makes them glow in the dark, they're probably going to be eaten more easily, which may end up making that species unviable. All right. Okay, females outnumbering males or whatever, this is too much of an inference here, right? You can maybe squint and say, oh, well, there's a negative long-term impact there because, people are 50-50 generally. Like we wouldn't want that elsewhere, right? Like who knows how you might read A to interpret or infer that this is a negative long-term effect, but it has to be a lot clearer than that. We don't want to make an unsafe inference on the SAT. B is kind of a opposite distractor, right? This is saying there are insufficient studies on the impact. Okay, if there are insufficient studies on the impact, how would we know that there may be significant long-term negative impacts? Can't. And then finally, C has nothing to do with impact. C just kind of is saying that, we don't know enough. We don't know where they've been introduced or whatever. Okay, so D is the only answer choice which shows any sort of clear linkage between the escape of these transgenic glow-in-the-dark fish and a negative impact in wild ecosystems. All right, so question 13 is an example of a command of evidence qualitative question. So what we want to find, the most important thing for us to comprehend from this passage is Ibanez and the colleagues' conclusion. Once we have that, we can go to the graph and try to find something that links. All right, so they concluded that anthropogenic nitrogen deposition could more than offset the effect provided that change is moderate rather than extreme. All right, so basically they were studying this general thing about like whether adding fertilizer or not adding fertilizer would be beneficial to trees depending on how much climate changes over the time frame of adding that fertilizer, right? So basically, we want to say that like with moderate change, with this caveat of the change being moderate. All right. So what we basically want to see here is that by adding nitrogen to growth of sugar maple trees, we are still going to see a better outcome in growing trees with nitrogen than we would even without climate change without nitrogen, right? So fertilizer in a moderate climate change scenario still is going to be better than no fertilizer with no climate change. However, in an extreme situation, right, the impacts of climate change will be so hard that even with fertilizer, we're going to be struggling to meet the levels of production that we had prior to climate change. Okay, so D says that, right? So under moderate climate change, we see growth of our sugar maple with fertilizer being larger than that without fertilizer during normal climate. However, once we see extreme change, our normal fertilizer-less sugar maple growth is still bigger than the growth would be with fertilizer. All right. Therefore, D. One of the things I'm always on the lookout for on a command of evidence question is an answer choice that might be correct or might correctly or accurately kind of like, not accurately, an answer choice that would be correct if it were true in the data. All right. So we want to make sure there isn't an answer choice. We want to make sure we avoid answer choices, which might say something along the lines of, something like this, right? So if this were true, it might be an interest, actually not, some of these, if they were true, might support the claim or the conclusion made by Ibanez and team. However, is C true, right? Well, it's kind of irrelevant. So therefore, we have to go with answer choice D because it perfectly describes the situation in which adding nitrogen makes the sugar maples grow more, even if we have moderate climate change, than they would grow in a normal climate situation without fertilizer. Okay, so 19 is a classic example of a question where we need to know vocabulary, even if this isn't a word and context question. All right, so what is ambivalence? We need to know what ambivalence means. Ambi means both, right? So I put up both of my hands because ambidextrous is one of the most common ways we talk about ambi, where one hand and the other hand both are equally good. All right. Ambivalence is when you're on kind of like two sides of feeling. You have a positive and a negative, right? So ambivalence can mean either kind of like having no strong feelings, right? You're like unsure of whether you're positive or negative, or you kind of have mixed feelings, meaning one positive, one negative. You're on both sides of the fence. All right. So, here we want to see someone that says it has merits, it has good parts, but there's also something ungood, something not as good about it, right? So a perfect contempt, right? So disliking poetry, even if you have a perfect contempt for it, you may discover still something good, which is a place for the genuine. All right. A, okay, says things that are important. Does this mention poetry whatsoever? If you think it does, you're making too wild of an inference, right? You might infer, well, the poem is called poetry and it says that these things are important. So maybe it's saying that, these things are also poetry and, whatever. Okay, you're making too wild of an inference there to see poetry in this at all, because it doesn't mention it. Okay. Finally, additionally, B, though it mentions poetry, does it mention any of the merits of poetry? No, it just kind of focuses on the displeasure of reading bad work by half poets. And finally, C is just negative, right? It says they're so derivative, we don't understand them, right? And we don't like what we cannot understand because they are so derivative, right? Meaning that's such a copy. Okay, that is just a displeasure of reading poetry. There is no merit shown there. As such, the only one which shows ambivalence, meaning though there is a bit of displeasure, there's also a bit of merit, is D. All right, so question 15 here is actually one of the more interesting questions by SAT standards I've seen in quite a while. All right, this topic is really interesting. If you are one of the rare students with a bit of interest in you don't want to help the world just so you get into Harvard. You actually want to be interested in helping the world. It's not because well, if I help the world, it's more likely I will get into the Ivy League education I deserve naturally to go to because I go to one of the top schools, right? If that's not your opinion, rare, maybe you can use, your kind of like STEM backgrounds, particularly engineering, maybe geology, soil sciences, things like that, to look into aquifer input and to look to solve what will be a water crisis in the West because we have changing modes of precipitation, right? Or changing styles of precipitation, even if the quantity of precipitation we receive may remain the same. So here, what is our graph saying? Okay, I'm just going to explain this graph because this graph is a little bit tricky. All right, so if precipitation concentration increases, right, what changes will we see in aquifer input and irrigation output? All right, so this is in locations where precipitation is currently somewhat concentrated. All right, so what does this mean? Concentrated precipitation, right? So when we see down here in the text, concentration mean precipitation is in fewer but more intense rain and snow events. All right. So this is something that will happen according to researchers and is the given, if you will. It's the thing that is like it's happening according to this modeling. All right. So things are becoming more concentrated. Now, we have two different kind of experimental groups here, right? One in which precipitation right now, prior to this increased concentration, is already currently somewhat concentrated. So a good example would be somewhere like San Diego, right? We don't receive really any rain from probably about May till October, right? We really receive no precipitation at all. And then we have a few rain events from, November through, maybe April, in which a single day can deliver 1/10 of our total year's rainfall. We get around 11 or 12 inches of rain a year, and we can see a day in which 2 to 3 inches of rain falls all in one day, right? We can see even more than that, right? We can see up to a quarter in one day's rain event. All right, so places which are already concentrated, by getting more concentrated, we have more water entering our aquifers, a little bit of an increase in water used for irrigation, and a little bit of increase in groundwater used for irrigation. So the more concentrated we get, we will have marginal increases in aquifer use and recharge. Now, places where it is evenly distributed, rainfall is more evenly distributed. All right, places like the Rocky Mountains, okay, where it snows a lot in the wintertime, but it also rains a lot in the summer because of thunderstorms coming from the Midwest, right? If those areas get more concentrated, we see that there is a much higher use in surface water for irrigation and a much higher use in groundwater for irrigation, right? So places where it is currently evenly distributed, getting more concentration of participation, meaning it happens less over a consistent span of time, but happens in more, concentrated bursts of extreme precipitation. Places that change from evenly distributed to concentrated have a greater increase in water use needs, right? So, the most important thing for us to read, for us to comprehend from the passage, is their conclusion. So what is their conclusion? Well, that as we increase concentration, we will have more irrigation. But that this change is highly sensitive to the initial baseline that exists in an area, right? So what supports that? Well, what we just described. What supports this claim that any increase in concentration will result in greater use of irrigation, but it is in places that are going from evenly distributed to concentrated that we see that increase in irrigation happen the most, is going to be supported by answer choice B, right? If it's already concentrated, irrigation use will increase, but only slightly. But if it is currently evenly distributed, irrigation will increase by 9 and 8% basically for groundwater and surface water irrigation, okay? One thing we want to be aware of here are answer choices that like either misread the graph or misidentify the conclusion, okay? D misreads the graph, all right? So where do we see a negative number here, where we see a decline in water use for irrigation? Nowhere, right? So this misreads the graph. A, we are misreading what their point is, okay? Up to here is pretty good, right? But we're not comparing, in this instance, the percent change in water entering aquifers. What we are looking to identify is the percent change in irrigation use. So this, while it is true, is irrelevant to the question because it's not part of their conclusion, right? It is in the graph, but it is not in a part of the graph that is relevant to the conclusion of Persad and her team. All right. Then finally, C, we again are talking about the wrong parameters. We are comparing the increase in aquifers compared to the increase in irrigation, when we need to be comparing the increase in irrigation across the two different experimental groups, right? So C and A compare the wrong things, right? We need to be comparing irrigation across the experimental groups, but A compares aquifers in one group to aquifer recharge in one group to irrigation use in the other, whereas C compares aquifer recharge in one group to irrigation use in that same group. And then D does a misread of the facts and figures as a whole. As such, the only answer choice that makes sense here is B. Again, look into this a little bit. Your lives will be severely impacted by this, regardless of how much money, you might make by, fabricating some half-truths on your college application and getting into a place you deserve, like, now I'm getting into Duke, okay? Take a look at this. It's pretty interesting. And with that, we end the reading section of Module 2 and move on to the writing section. So we're here on question 16 of Module 2 on our 395 reading and writing test. 16's got to be about the easiest question on this test. If you're missing a question like this, simply put, you either are moving too quickly or you're not really paying attention to the questions, because this one is pretty straightforward. We're looking to understand the tense of publish, right? To publish needs to be conjugated into the proper tense. You see that this is in the past, therefore we're going to go with the past tense. Publishing is something that's ongoing, but this is finished, right? You might be enticed by, oh, look, it says showing, therefore it needs to be publishing, right? But it doesn't make sense. Having published would lend itself to something coming next, which we don't have. And to publish is the infinitive form. We need to conjugate it into the past. Therefore, we need to go with A. So question 17 here on module 2 is a classic example of, if you missed it, it's likely you made a classic example of the mistake in which we put commas when we feel like maybe we want them there, rather than thinking about what does a comma actually accomplish? What is the actual role of a comma? And do we need to accomplish that here? So in this instance, when harpsichord's keys are pressed, the strings inside the instrument are plucked, not struck, okay? So you might think, I'm used to seeing a pair of commas around things, right? But that would create a non-essential phrase, a non-essential element. We need that there, right? Which is why we can also get rid of C. With A, whenever we see a colon, everything that comes before that colon should be able to stand on its own as a sentence. And when we read this, when a harpsichord's keys are pressed, the strings inside the instrument, that is not resolved. Okay. So B is the only one that does the right thing here. If you're making a mistake here, you're likely choosing D, in which case I would say, make sure you want to make sure you're not arbitrarily putting commas in places because you think that something is long or short, but you're really thinking, what are the roles of commas? Lists, non-essential phrases, separating clauses, things like that. Okay, so 18, we have a question about what we would call a non-essential phrase, or in this case, it's actually functioning as an appositive. Either way, a little break in a sentence in which we introduce information that is helpful, clarifies something, but it isn't necessary for the sentence to function, right? We create this with either a pair of commas, like we see in C, a pair of dashes, or a pair of parentheses. They always have to be the same pair of punctuation. So, few kind of red herrings here, a few distractors. When we look at A, you might have learned, okay, we need a comma and a fan voice to connect two independent clauses. And you like this idea of seeing a comma and a fanboy being and connected to one another. However, does that function? Does what comes before that comma and after stand on its own? Julian Alvarez' 1994 novel In the Time of Butterflies, a fictionalized account of the lives of the Mirabal sisters, and can serve as a starting point for etc. Okay, clearly that doesn't work. Our first thing there is it only has a subject. Okay, there's no verb there. So it can't be a clause, let alone an independent clause. So it can't stand on its own for that reason. All right. B suggests we have more than one subject, or more than one subject within the appositive. So Mirabal and others, right? But doesn't work there. And finally, D is a run-on. So C, what is our non-essential phrase? A fictionalized account of the lives of the Mirabal sisters, meaning we can say this as such. Julian Alvarez's 1994 novel, In the Time of the Butterflies, can serve as a starting point for those wanting to explore how the rule of dictator Rafael Trujillo has been represented in Dominican American literature, right? That Julia Alvarez, not Julian, not the soccer player from Argentina. That altogether is an independent clause that can stand on its own, and a fictionalized account of the lives of the Mirabal sisters is something we're adding in to provide some information that's helpful but not necessary. So question 19, we have an elaboration. All right, so remember what elaborations are. They're little bits of information that are tacked onto the end of a sentence to elaborate or clarify information that comes previous to it. One thing we always want to know about elaborations, they must come after something that could stand alone as a sentence. So in this case, the vessel took 6 days to dislodge, in part due to its sheer size. Okay, that can stand as a sentence. The vessel took 6 days to dislodge, in part due to its sheer size. Perfectly fine on its own. But we clarify what its sheer size in fact was. It's as heavy as 2,000 blue whales when fully loaded. All right, so that is a clear example of an elaboration. What do we know about elaborations? We can create them with either a colon, like we see in B, or we can create them with a dash. We're not given the dash option. All right. The special thing about elaborations is what comes after that colon or dash doesn't need to be able to stand on its own. It's as heavy as 2,000 blue whales when fully loaded, couldn't stand on its own as a sentence, right? But it's nice to add here in this with a colon. All right. C, we never create an elaboration with just a comma, right? We would do that if the second part was a dependent clause, let's say, right? We can connect a dependent clause to an independent clause with a comma or vice versa, but we don't have that here. D, we don't have any punctuation at all after size, which we would need because that's an independent clause that could stand on its own. And then A creates the same issue as C because it is using a comma to introduce an elaboration. But in actuality, we must use a colon to introduce an elaboration or a dash, which we're not offered. Therefore, our answer is B. Question 20, we have a little bit of a tricky idea regarding what a subject is, what the subject of a sentence is, and what we need to clarify the subject of a sentence. All right. First things first, some of you might know Moana, the movie. You might know the crab. You may even know Jermaine Clement was in The Flight of the Conchords, one of the funnier, more interesting, great television shows of this century. He is a pinnacle of comedy. He also was involved in What We Do in the Shadows, which is this spoof about vampires. All that notwithstanding, not really relevant to the grammar here, but cool for you to know. Look him up. So basically here, we want to make sure that we're not separating the subject at all. We don't want to distort our subject. So what is our subject, right? The character Tamatoa the crab. That's all one thing all together. The character Tamatoa the crab, right? We don't want to make the crab a non-essential phrase. We don't want to change anything here because this is a noun, basically, this is the subject, a noun. So that all needs to be all together. It all is essential, right, to identifying the character. So it cannot be separated. Here we have a random comma splice, right? We don't have anything that requires any sort of separation here. C, we have an arbitrary colon, right? Colons introduce elaborations, colons introduce lists in particular instances. Here, what is it doing? And then finally, D, this is the one that many of us maybe fell for. D separates our subject, our important noun, the character Tamatoa the crab, to suggest that part of it is necessary and part of it isn't. But we can't separate this from each other. They are the same thing. To put a comma between it would be to separate it. Therefore, our only answer choice is A. Question 21 of Module 2 is definitely one of the harder questions we'll see on a SAT grammar. This is pretty tricky, and it's the final question in the sequence, which makes sense. So in her 1983 book, The Managed Heart, Sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild first explored at length her conception of a sociology of emotions. The idea here we have that dash working as an elaboration, by the way. The idea that the various cultural and ideological frameworks a person has internalized something, each emotion reaction that the person has within a situation. All right. So I'm assuming a lot of us are missing this question by choosing A, underlies, right? Now, that would be the case is it because if we perhaps were reading this and thought the subject was singular, all right? If we perhaps thought that the idea is what underlies something, right? But what we actually have here is a plural subject, frameworks that we must conjugate our thing to. What is the plural option here? Underlie. So remember, when we conjugate things, the S is what we use to go with something singular. No S means we're going with something plural. It's the opposite of what we would do to a noun. Okay. Has been underlying is just, too much here. It's not that it like creates the wrong notion. It's just doesn't make any sense. And then B, the idea that the various frameworks is underlying each individual. Now there we have the same issue of treating the situation as singular when we need to treat it plural. All right. D does the same thing, has been. All of those options, underlies, is underlying, and has been underlying, suggest that we have a singular noun that we're referring to. But rather, we're referring to something that's plural, frameworks. Therefore, we need our conjugation to align with that, underlie. 22 here on Module 2 is about as classic an example of time as a transition as we could ever get. Okay. This one is pretty straightforward. When we see first, we know that we're in a list where transitions therefore need to build and suggest time, right? I always want us thinking about what role does our transition fulfill here, and thinking about the categories transitions can fall into, contrasting information or supporting information or what have you. In this case, we're just trying to show time. We're trying to show a list. And next is the thing that does that. For example, would need to suggest that, would need the thing that comes after to suggest that what comes before is something that can be exemplified. Similarly, would mean that they are similar things pretty clearly, and in contrast is the same thing. This is about as straightforward of a transitions question as we could ever see. We see first, next, or then, and then lastly. Right? We know that we're operating in this time situation with the transitions, so we just want to do that and work with next. Sometimes I think students are afraid of choosing things like next or then or what have you, a simple common word as a transition, as opposed to something more interesting as in contrast, or for example, right? However, or a thus sounds more interesting than next, but we need to make sure that we're actually just fulfilling the role that the transition, or we're identifying the role that the transition is fulfilling. That's our goal. That's it. So that's why we go with them next. 23 and 22 are about as related of questions as you'll ever see on this test. All right, these are very, very, very similar. They're both transitions questions, and in both cases, the transitions are showing time. All right. I wonder if the College Board noticed something on any of their first tests that they released about students missing questions with time as a transitional adverb. So here we have first ever with a date. Then we see a later date describing something else. All right. Therefore, we have to go with later. I think a lot of us likely miss this by choosing either for example or in other words. All right. In other words is a summary transition, right? It would be the same thing as saying in sum. It describes what came before in a bit of a different way. That isn't what happens here. We have a new situation. This is not a storytelling competition. This is a platform. We have a completely new subject. Therefore, we're not going to use in other words. For example, is when we exemplify, obviously, what came before. So this second sentence would need to exemplify the case that came in the first sentence, being the storytelling competition. That maybe the story that he told. Yet it doesn't do that, right? It pivots to a new subject showing what he did in another situation. If you're choosing things other than later, I'm thinking you're probably worried about if later is sophisticated enough or something like that. But in this case, it perfectly works to show the trajectory, the progression of time, which is exactly what 22 does as well. So keep an eye out and make sure you're just thinking about what role does my transition fulfill and how do I get there? Question 24 is our final transitions question on Module 2, our final transitions question on 395 in general. This one is a little bit trickier than the first two we saw in Module 2, but is nonetheless still relatively straightforward. What we are looking for is to identify what kind of transition, what role of a transition must we put to create the correct logical connection between these two sentences. Or in other words, we need to figure out what is the relationship between sentence 1 and sentence 2, and how do I show that relationship? So what is the relationship, we should ask? It is that sentence 1 says, just a gene is not enough, right? There are many factors we need to consider and many interactions. 2 says, as a result of this, because of this previous thing, we therefore should do something else, right? Meaning focus or study the proteome, which is the complete set of proteins expressed by a human genes. Don't get too bogged down in the technical language or the jargon here. That isn't what's going to make this answer choice or lead you to the correct answer choice here or not. You just have to think about the logic, all right? So what we need is a cause and effect type transition. Classic examples would be thus, therefore, as a result, right? The only one here that does that is accordingly. Accordingly means in accordance with, or according to, as such, we should do something else, right? This fits that category of transitions. So you should study our transitions categories if you're missing a question like this, because accordingly is one of those, it's a great example of a cause and effect transition, but is maybe not one of the first examples we'd think of, like thus or therefore. In other words, would be to redefine what came before, right? So if it said something like, in other words, a gene is not enough, right? If it simplified it, we would use that, but that's not what we have here. That said is a pivot. That being said is typically how it's written. It's a pivot like however. And finally, for example, exemplifies what came before. It's basically adding additional information that clarifies a claim that was made earlier. It doesn't it isn't used to build off a claim. It isn't a cause and effect. It's not a consequence type thing, right? When we say, for example, we're saying, looking at this, we should see this. For example, usually would come after something like thus. So like the sentence after a sentence beginning with thus. So therefore, or accordingly, our only answer choice that works here would be accordingly. Answer choice D. Question 25 is the first of our rhetorical synthesis questions on Module 2 of 395. So these rhetorical synthesis questions, you always see these notes and have to think, what am I supposed to do with these notes? A lot of times with these questions, I like us looking at the question first before we look at the text. I don't recommend this strategy for any other question on the test. And I also would say that if you're really good on time, if you're never running out of time, you can look at the text first. But looking at the question really shows what we need to focus on. These questions aren't usually asking us to summarize the notes. Usually they're asking us to say, what if this information is actually relevant and what if it is not to the task I'm being assigned? So what do we want to do? We want to specify when the landmass theory was published. All right. So What is the landmass? Well, this. When was it published? 1037. We must choose an answer that says 1037. B through D, none of them say 1037, simply put. All right. Those all might be better summaries of his landmass theory. Those might be interesting discussions of his landmass theory, but only A says when the landmass theory was published, which is what the student wants to specify. Therefore, the only answer choice that has the parameter they're asking us is A, and therefore it is the only answer choice which works. So that's why we have to go with A. Really make sure that you're just focused on kind of excising, to use a vocab word, or getting rid of all the things that we don't need. So question 26 is a rhetorical synthesis question. This question type is the rare question type that I would recommend looking at the question first. No other question type on the reading and writing should you do that. If you're doing that, you're setting yourself up for traps. And I'd also say you don't have to read the question first here. Maybe more of something I would suggest if you're running low on time. But these questions are a little tricky because it may be implied kind of sublingually, right, or subliminally, that your goal is to summarize in some way these notes all together. But that's not what we're being asked. We're usually just being asked what information is relevant to the claim, right, or the goal, and everything else that isn't relevant must be not there. We need what's from the goal, and that's it. So what is the goal? To contrast first-class levers and second-class levers. All right. So we need these two notes right here to be in our answer choice. If they are not, the answer choice cannot be correct, right? So, now, we want to do this most effectively as well, all right? So A just talks about levers or levers. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. In general, notice what's missing. First and second class offerings, right? C, we mention first and second class, but what's missing here? Contrasting them, right? We are just focusing on a similarity between first and second class levers. So that leaves us between B and D, all right? So what is the difference here? Not just that one is shorter, right? We want to talk a little bit about what is actually functionally different here. While it acknowledges a difference, right, that there is a difference that exists, talking about B here. While it acknowledges that there is a difference, it doesn't specify what the difference is. It doesn't actually most effectively contrast them. I think if you're getting this one wrong, and you're choosing B, you're on the right path, but you're not going far enough to read all the answer choices. D does the same thing that B does, but does it in a clear way, right? And does it to all the details that we need. B just says, well, first and second class levers are different, right? Sure, that contrasts them, but not in a very effective way. Whereas D says first class levers and second class levers are different because the fulcrum and the load are located in different places, and this is where they're located differently. It specifies, and therefore does it better than B. This is probably one of the trickier kind of rhetorical synthesis questions we could get, because B is very close. It has the parameters we need, but it doesn't describe them well enough. That's why we go with D. So question 27 is the final question on the test, final on module 2, and the final rhetorical synthesis question that we would be asked on the test. I've said this for every video I've ever made on rhetorical synthesis questions, so I'll say it again in case this is the first one you've ever watched. I want us focusing on the question. Unlike any other question on the SAT, it's okay if you read the question before you read the passage. Right? Before you read this stuff, it's okay to read this stuff. There's no other time that I'm okay with that, right? Any other question type, if you're doing that, you're setting yourself up for trap. But here, if you're running a little out of time, it kind of makes sense to me. Why? Well, because we're not being asked what we might assume we would be asked. We're not being asked to summarize these notes, to give the most perfect encapsulation of these notes, right? We're being asked something very specific, usually involving just one or two of the notes. So in this case, we want to just emphasize a similarity between these types of waves. So we're not talking about how they can be different in the way they function. We don't want to talk about, what their impacts are. We just want to talk about a similarity between the two, right? So we see a lot of differences between the two. P waves are faster or they're quicker, right? P waves compress and expand, whereas S waves cause it to move from side to side rather than forward and back, right? So these are all differences, okay? But what's something that they both do? They both travel beneath the Earth's surface, all right? That is inferred, that is implied. It isn't a note, but it is logical to see that, right? And they both cause the ground to move. While one is forward and backwards and one is side to side, they both move. That's why A is correct, okay? That encapsulates everything we can infer about similarities from 27. We want to stick to safe inferences, right? B is a difference. Even if that's correct, it's identifying a difference. C doesn't say anything about S waves. We need to make sure that we're seeing the similarity between both of them. And then finally, D, we see a similarity, but it's focusing on the difference, right? So we need to be focused. We need to emphasize that there's something similar between P waves and S waves. That's all we're asked to do. And A is the only answer which accomplishes that goal. And that finishes question 27 and 395 as a whole.